November 25, 1783. New York Harbor. The wind is cold. The sky is gray. And the most powerful empire on earth is packing its bags. One man stands alone on the deck of a departing ship, watching a continent slip away forever. His expression tells the entire story of an empire in retreat. Behind him, thousands of lives hang in the balance. Loyalists, refugees, formerly enslaved men and women, all waiting, all desperate, all depending on one general to save them. Every step taken onto those ships was a step away from everything Britain had built in America. Every boot on that gangplank was the sound of an empire saying goodbye. Among those waiting were thousands of black men, women, and children. They had fought for Britain. They had been promised freedom. And today, they were about to find out if that promise would be kept. And then it happened. The Union Jack came down for the last time over American soil. Slowly, silently, like the final breath of a dying empire. The fleet moved out slowly. Dozens of warships, hundreds of transport vessels, carrying the broken remnants of the first British Empire into the cold Atlantic morning. But how did it come to this? How did the most powerful military force on Earth end up signing away a continent? The answer begins not in 1783, but decades earlier with one extraordinary soldier. As the British sailed away, George Washington rode in. The contrast could not have been more powerful. One general arriving in triumph, another departing in dignified silence. Two worlds, two destinies, two generals, one winning an empire of his own, one surrendering the empire he had spent his life defending. This is the story of the man who watched it all end. To understand the general who lost an empire, we must first understand the boy who would become that general. Ireland, 1724. A land of green hills and gray skies, and a child born into a world of military tradition. From his earliest years, he was drawn to the horizon, to something beyond the green fields of his Irish home. He wanted to serve. He wanted to matter. He would get his wish, in ways he could never have imagined. At 17, he joined the British Army, standing in the mud of an Irish barracks, wearing a uniform 2 sizes too large. He was one of thousands of young men who answered the call of the crown. But unlike most of them, he would rise to shape the fate of nations. His commission came quickly. He had a mind for strategy and an instinct for leadership that his superiors could not ignore. He was patient when others were reckless, calm when others panicked. These qualities would define his career. His destiny lay across the Atlantic. North America was calling, and Britain needed soldiers in the vast wilderness of the New World. The crossing was brutal, weeks of stormy seas and cramped conditions. But what awaited him would change everything. Quebec, 1759. The jewel of French North America. Perched on dramatic cliffs above the St. Lawrence River, it was one of the most fortified cities in the world, and Britain wanted it. What happened here would forge the general who would one day oversee the loss of an empire. The Battle of the Plains of Abraham. September 13, 1759. 2 armies, 2 empires, 1 plateau outside Quebec City. The British advanced in perfect disciplined lines. The French waited behind their walls. What happened next would echo through centuries. The Battle of the Plains of Abraham. September 13, 1759. 2 armies, 2 empires, 1 plateau outside Quebec City. The British advanced in perfect disciplined lines. The French waited behind their walls. What happened next would echo through centuries. The young officer who knelt beside the dying Wolfe that day had survived when his commander had not. It was a lesson he would never forget. Survival was not just about winning battles. It was about what you did after the smoke cleared. Quebec fell. Canada became British. And the young Irish officer who had fought on those frozen plains found himself suddenly responsible for administering a vast conquered territory. This was where he truly learned the difference between winning a war and governing a peace. But while he governed in the north, a storm was brewing in the south. Boston, 1770. The relationship between Britain and its American colonies had been deteriorating for years. Taxes, trade restrictions, and now British soldiers patrolling colonial streets. The Americans were running out of patience. March 5, 1770. Boston. British soldiers opened fire on a crowd of colonial protesters. 5 Americans died. The news spread through the colonies like wildfire. They called it a massacre. Britain called it self-defense. But the damage was done. The revolution had found its first martyrs. December 16, 1773. Angry colonists, disguised as Mohawk Indians, boarded British ships in Boston Harbor and threw 342 chests of tea into the freezing water. It was an act of defiance that shook the British government to its core. The colonies were no longer just complaining. They were fighting back. In London, Parliament was in uproar. Some politicians demanded an iron fist response. Others warned that crushing the colonies would be a catastrophic mistake. The debate raged for months. But in the end, the hardliners won. Britain would send more troops, more taxes, more control. It would prove to be the worst possible decision. King George III refused to bend. He was a man of absolute conviction. The colonies were British property. They would obey. They would pay their taxes. They would respect the crown. What he failed to understand was that the people across the Atlantic no longer saw themselves as British subjects. They saw themselves as Americans. April 19, 1775. Lexington Green, Massachusetts. 77 colonial Minutemen faced 250 British regulars in the early morning mist. Neither side wanted to fire first. But someone did. And with that single shot, the world changed forever. The shot heard round the world. 8 Minutemen died on Lexington Green that morning. But what died with them was something far more significant. The idea that this conflict could be resolved peacefully. The American Revolution had begun. The British quickly discovered that this was not a conventional war. The Americans refused to fight in straight lines. They hid behind trees. They struck and retreated. They used the land itself as a weapon. The redcoats were fighting shadows. And losing. In Quebec, the governor was watching the situation with growing alarm. He had spent years building a relationship with the Canadian population. He understood the delicate balance required to keep the colony loyal. And now that balance was being threatened from every direction. The Americans were coming north. Benedict Arnold led a force of 1,000 Continental soldiers through the brutal Canadian wilderness toward Quebec. They were half-starved, frozen, and exhausted. But they were coming, and the governor of Quebec had to stop them. New Year's Eve 1775. A blinding snowstorm. The Continental Army launched a desperate night attack on the walls of Quebec City. British defenders fired down from the walls. The attack failed. Arnold was wounded. 300 Americans were captured. Quebec held. And the general who held it had just proven his worth. He stood on those walls through the worst of the storm. Calm. Unshakable. He had fewer men than the attackers. He had limited ammunition and dwindling supplies. But he had something the Americans lacked. He knew exactly what he was defending. And he was not about to give it up. The Battle of Three Rivers. June 1776. The British counterattacked. The Continental Army, already weakened by disease and desertion, was overwhelmed. 600 Americans were captured. The rest fled south. Canada was saved. The northern front of the revolution was over. The Americans retreated in disorder. Sick, defeated, humiliated. It was a crushing blow for the young revolution. But in the South, the war was taking a very different turn. And the tide was about to shift in ways that no one in London could have predicted. Valley Forge. Winter 1777. George Washington's army was dying. 2,000 soldiers perished from cold, disease, and starvation. The Continental Congress was broke. The revolution seemed to be collapsing. But Washington refused to surrender. He trained. He reorganized. He waited. And his patience would be rewarded. Saratoga. October 1777. The turning point of the entire war. A British army of nearly 6,000 men, marching south from Canada, walked into a trap. The Continental Army surrounded them, cut off their supply lines, and waited for the inevitable. General Burgoyne surrendered. Nearly 6,000 British soldiers laid down their arms. It was the greatest British military disaster since the beginning of the war. And it changed everything. Because now, watching from across the Atlantic, France decided it was time to join the fight. Paris, 1778. The French-American alliance was signed. France recognized American independence. French money, French ships, and French soldiers would now pour into the revolution. Britain was no longer fighting a colonial rebellion. It was fighting a world war. And it was losing. Yorktown, Virginia, October 1781. The combined forces of the Continental Army and the French military surrounded the last major British force in the south. Day after day the cannons pounded. The British position collapsed trench by trench. There was nowhere to go. No relief was coming. October 19, 1781. General Cornwallis surrendered. 8,000 British soldiers laid down their weapons. The British band played a tune called The World Turned Upside Down. They were right. It had been. The American Revolution was effectively over. But the hard part was just beginning. London, 1782. The British government was in crisis. Lord North's ministry had fallen. The Whigs, who had always opposed the war, were now in power. And they faced the most complex logistical challenge in British military history. How do you withdraw an entire army, a fleet, and tens of thousands of civilians from a continent you have just lost? The answer, the British government decided, was one man. They needed someone with experience. Someone who knew North America. Someone who could be trusted to manage a withdrawal without it turning into a catastrophe. They called him back from retirement. They gave him the hardest job in the British Empire. He arrived in New York in May 1782. The city was still under British control. But the mood was very different from the confident swagger of the early war years. The soldiers were demoralized. The loyalists were terrified. And the clock was ticking. New York had been the British headquarters for 7 years. It was a city of contradictions. British soldiers and American loyalists lived side by side, both knowing that their world was about to end. Shops were closing. Families were packing. Everyone was waiting for the inevitable. He established his headquarters in the Franklin Mansion and immediately buried himself in the logistics of the evacuation. The scale of what he faced was staggering. Over 25,000 troops, 10,000 loyalist civilians, thousands of black refugees, all needing ships, supplies, and destinations. The loyalist camps were heartbreaking. These were Americans who had remained loyal to the crown. They had lost their homes, their businesses, their farms. They had been attacked by their neighbors. Some had been tarred and feathered. They had sacrificed everything for Britain. And now Britain was leaving them behind. He visited the camps personally. He walked among the refugees. He listened to their stories. He made them a promise that Britain would not abandon them, that every man, woman, and child who needed passage would get it. It was a promise he intended to keep, no matter what it cost. In May 1783, the two great adversaries met face to face. The British general and the American commander-in-chief sat across a table from each other. It was a meeting that could have been filled with hostility and recrimination. Instead, it was marked by something unexpected: mutual respect. Washington had fought this man for years. He had tried to take his Quebec. He had tried to cut off his supply lines. And this British general had outmaneuvered him at every turn in the North. Yet Washington admired him, because he recognized in this British general something rare: a man of genuine honor. The evacuation was the most complex logistical operation the British military had ever attempted. Hundreds of ships had to be organized, supplies calculated, routes planned, all while the Americans waited impatiently outside the city, eager to take possession of what was now legally their territory. But among all the challenges he faced, none was more morally complex than the question of the black loyalists. During the war, Britain had offered freedom to any enslaved person who escaped their patriot master and reached British lines. Thousands had done so, and now they stood on the docks of New York, waiting to see if that promise would be honored. Many of them held certificates, pieces of paper signed by British officers, guaranteeing their freedom. They had earned those certificates through courage and sacrifice. They had served as soldiers, as spies, as laborers. They had risked everything. And now they clutched those pieces of paper like they were made of gold. Because in many ways they were. He ordered the creation of an extraordinary document. Every black loyalist seeking passage would be registered. Their names, their ages, their physical descriptions, their history. Every detail recorded in careful handwriting. This document would become known as the Book of Negroes, and it would become one of the most important historical documents in the story of black freedom in America. The Americans were furious. The Treaty of Paris required the return of all property taken during the war. And to the Southern plantation owners, enslaved people were property. They sent delegations to demand the return of the black loyalists. He listened to them, and then he said no. He told them clearly and directly that he had given these people his personal guarantee of freedom, that Britain had promised them liberty in exchange for their service, that he would not, under any circumstances, break that promise. The Americans threatened. He did not move. He was immovable, and it was perhaps the most important stand he ever took. One by one, the black loyalists boarded the ships. Over 3,000 men, women, and children, each one registered in the Book of Negroes, each one protected by his personal guarantee. It was not a perfect solution, could not undo the years of slavery they had endured, but it was something. It was a general keeping his word. The plantation owners watched helplessly as their former enslaved people sailed away to freedom. They were enraged. They would spend years trying to seek compensation from the British government. Some historians estimate the value of the freed slaves at millions in modern terms. But the British stood firm. The promise had been made. The promise would be kept. The ships sailed north, toward Nova Scotia, toward a new life in a cold and unfamiliar land. It would not be easy. The Canadian winters were brutal. The land was uncleared. The promises of British assistance would often fall short. But they were free, and they were alive, and they were together. They arrived on the shores of Nova Scotia with almost nothing. But they had their freedom. They built communities. They established churches. They fought for land rights. They created a black Canadian heritage that endures to this day. And it all began because one British general refused to break his word. The Book of Negroes survived. Today it sits in the British National Archives in London. 3,434 names, each one a human being who crossed the threshold from slavery to freedom. It is one of the most powerful documents in the history of the Atlantic world, and it bears his authority on every page. November 1783, the final evacuation began. 25,000 British soldiers marching through the streets of New York for the last time. Americans lined the sidewalks. Some cheered. Some watched in silence. Some wept. Even victory can carry the weight of sadness when it means the end of a world you have always known. The last British soldier looked back at the city he had called home for 7 years. What did he see? A place that had been British and was now American. A city that would never fly the Union Jack again. He turned. He stepped onto the ship. And an empire ended. The fleet moved out in convoy. Slowly. Majestically. Even in retreat, the British Navy maintained its discipline and its dignity. He had insisted on that. If they were leaving, they would leave with their heads held high. They would not slink away like criminals. They would depart as soldiers, with honor. He stood at the stern of his ship and watched America disappear into the gray November horizon. What was he thinking? We cannot know for certain, but we know what he had done. He had kept his promises. He had protected his people. He had managed the impossible. He had lost an empire with his humanity intact. Within hours of the British departure, George Washington entered New York City at the head of the Continental Army. The crowds erupted. After 7 years of British occupation, New York was American again. Washington rode through cheering streets, knowing that the nation he had fought to create was finally, truly, free. All across the city, British signs came down and American ones went up. The transformation was immediate and visceral. 7 years of occupation ended not with a battle but with a parade. Not with blood but with celebration. The empire had gone. The Republic had arrived. The Treaty of Paris was signed on September 3, 1783. Britain formally recognized the independence of the United States of America. The territory east of the Mississippi River and south of the Great Lakes was ceded to the new nation. It was the largest territorial concession in British history. An empire lost at the stroke of a pen. In London, the reaction was one of national mourning. Politicians who had supported the war sat in stunned silence. The greatest empire the world had ever seen had lost 13 of its most valuable colonies. The questions began immediately. How had it happened? Who was to blame? And perhaps most importantly, what came next? The news hit the British public like a physical blow. Newspaper headlines screamed of national humiliation. Coffee houses buzzed with anger and recrimination. Someone had to be blamed. Generals were criticized. Politicians were pilloried. But the truth was more complex than any single scapegoat could absorb. Britain had lost America because America had chosen to be free. But while London mourned, he was already thinking ahead. The loss of the 13 colonies did not have to mean the end of the British Empire in North America. There was still Canada. There was still hope. And he was going to build something new from the ruins of what had been lost. Quebec City, 1784. He returned to the land he had first conquered 25 years earlier. But everything was different now. The empire had shrunk. The population was nervous. And the loyalist refugees pouring in from the south were creating tensions that threatened to tear the remaining colonies apart. He was appointed Governor-General of British North America. It was a title that carried enormous responsibility. He was now the most powerful man in the remaining British territories on the continent. And he faced a challenge that in some ways was even more complex than the war he had just survived. 50,000 loyalists had fled north. They were Americans who had chosen Britain. They had lost everything. Their homes, their businesses, their communities. They arrived in Canada with nothing but their loyalty and their determination. And they needed land. They needed laws. They needed a government. They needed him. He understood that the key to holding Canada was unity. The French Canadians had their language, their religion, their legal system. The English loyalists wanted English law and Protestant institutions. These two communities needed to coexist. And they needed a framework that would allow them to do so without tearing each other apart. In the forests of what would become Ontario, Loyalist settlers were literally carving a new world out of the wilderness. Trees fell. Cabins rose. Fields were cleared from the dense Canadian bush. It was backbreaking work. But these people had nowhere else to go. Canada was their home now, and they intended to make it worthy of the name. The new American Republic watched the Loyalist exodus with mixed feelings. Some Americans felt guilty. These were their neighbors, their friends, their relatives. Others felt justified. The Loyalists had chosen the wrong side. They had gotten what they deserved. But history would judge differently. These Loyalists would go on to build a nation that would become one of America's greatest allies. He worked for years on the solution, page after page of careful argument, map after map of the proposed divisions. He was proposing something radical. Divide the province of Quebec into 2 separate colonies. Upper Canada for the English-speaking Loyalists, Lower Canada for the French-Canadian population. Give each community its own laws, its own institutions, its own identity within the British framework. The Constitutional Act of 1791 passed through the British Parliament. Quebec was divided. Upper Canada and Lower Canada were born, each with its own legislature, each with its own legal system. It was a masterpiece of political compromise. And it worked. Canada did not go the way of the 13 colonies. It remained British. And it remains a constitutional monarchy to this day. The division was not perfect. Tensions between French and English Canada would simmer for generations, and in some ways continue to this day. But the Constitutional Act gave Canada a framework for managing those tensions without violence. It was the foundation on which the modern Canadian nation would eventually be built. By the early 1790s, Upper Canada was beginning to look like a real colony. Towns were growing, churches were built, schools were established. The Loyalists had not just survived, they had thrived. And at the center of this transformation was the steady hand of the man who had overseen it all. The general who had lost one empire was quietly building another. Today, London stands as one of the great cities of the world. The British Empire that he served is long gone. But the institutions he helped build, the compromises he forged, the promises he kept, echo through the centuries. History has a way of remembering the consequences of actions long after the actors themselves are forgotten. And here, in modern New York Harbor, where the last British ships sailed away in 1783, the greatest city in the world goes about its business. Skyscrapers where once there were wooden docks. Container ships where once there were sailing frigates. But the water is the same. And somewhere beneath the surface of this modern harbor, the ghost of an empire still drifts. The Book of Negroes survives. Today it sits in the archives, its pages fragile but its message eternal. 3,434 names, men and women who crossed the boundary between bondage and freedom under his protection. It is his most lasting legacy, more significant than any battle he won or lost. In Halifax, Nova Scotia, the descendants of the Black Loyalists still live. They call themselves the Black Nova Scotians. They are among the oldest black communities in North America. They have been here for 240 years. Their ancestors arrived on his ships, and their existence is a testament to the power of one man keeping his word. Their story was largely forgotten for 2 centuries, but in recent decades, historians and descendants have worked to reclaim it. The Book of Negroes became the basis for a celebrated novel and television series. The Black Loyalist Heritage Center was opened in Birchtown, Nova Scotia. Their voices are finally being heard. Their history is finally being told. At Yorktown, where the empire effectively died, tourists walk the same ground where British and American soldiers fought and died. The cannons are silent now. The earthworks are grown over with grass. But the site still carries the weight of what happened here. The weight of a world that changed forever on these Virginia fields. In Quebec City, a plaque bears his name. He was later elevated to the peerage as Baron Dorchester. His name is not well known outside of Canada and specialist historical circles. But the nation of Canada itself is perhaps the most fitting monument to his work. He helped create it. He helped save it. And it endures. The Canadian Parliament stands today as a symbol of the constitutional legacy he helped create. The Constitutional Act of 1791 was the seed from which Canadian democracy grew. The nation that would one day stand beside Britain and America in 2 world wars was shaped in part by the decisions this one general made in the aftermath of a revolution he could not prevent. Historians who study this period often remark that he has been unfairly overlooked. His contemporaries who are remembered, Cornwallis, Burgoyne, Howe, are remembered primarily for their defeats. He is remembered, if at all, for a withdrawal. But a withdrawal conducted with humanity and skill is itself a form of victory. And it is time history recognized that. Every year, at historical sites across America and Britain, men and women dress in the uniforms of the Revolution and reenact the battles of that era. They do it to remember, to understand, to connect with a past that shaped the world we live in. And in those red coats, we see the ghost of an empire that once stretched from the Arctic to the Caribbean. Look at his portrait. Look at those eyes. They have seen things that most of us can barely imagine. They have watched battles rage and empires fall. They have looked into the eyes of enslaved people seeking freedom and made the decision to protect them. They have stared at the horizon where a continent once lay and watched it disappear forever. The Atlantic Ocean. The great body of water that once connected Britain to its American empire. It is the same ocean today as it was in 1783. But what lies on the other side has changed beyond all recognition. The colonies are gone. In their place stands the most powerful nation the world has ever seen. Born from revolution, shaped by sacrifice, and partly defined by the moment Britain let it go. He lived until 1808. He spent his final years in England, a respected and honored old man. He had been elevated to the peerage. He had been recognized for his service. But he never spoke publicly about the events of 1783. Perhaps because some things are too large for words. Perhaps because he understood that history would speak for itself. Today, Britain and America are the closest of allies. The special relationship, they call it. Two nations bound by language, history, culture, and shared sacrifice. It seems almost impossible to believe that these two great democracies once fought a bitter war against each other. But they did. And the man who managed the aftermath of that war helped make the reconciliation possible. The St. Lawrence River. He defended it twice. Once against the French. Once against the Americans. And both times he succeeded. This great river, flowing through the heart of Canada, is in some ways his monument. He understood that rivers connect people, that geography shapes destiny, and that Canada's destiny lay along this waterway. The British and Canadian flags fly side by side. Two nations, two identities, but one shared history, and at the root of that shared history is the work of the man who preserved the Canadian connection to Britain when everything else was falling apart. He did not just lose an empire, he saved a portion of it, and that portion grew into a great nation. In classrooms across America and Britain, the story of the Revolution is taught every year. But the name of the general who managed its aftermath is rarely mentioned. History remembers the victors. It remembers the great defeats. But it often forgets the quiet, competent men who cleaned up the mess and tried to preserve what remained of human dignity in the wreckage of great events. Stand at the edge of New York Harbor today and look out at the water. Somewhere out there, in 1783, the last British fleet sailed away. The soldiers are long gone. The ships are dust at the bottom of the ocean. But the moment endures. The moment when the greatest empire on earth turned its back on America and sailed into history. The Book of Negroes closes. 3,434 names preserved. 3,434 lives protected. In the end, when we measure the life of a general, we measure it not by the territory he held or the battles he won, but by the humanity he preserved when it would have been easier to abandon it. On that measure, this general stands very tall indeed. November 25, 1783. The last ship clears the harbor. The empire that had stretched from the frozen shores of Canada to the tobacco fields of Virginia is gone. But the man who oversaw its departure was not a failure. He was something rarer. He was a soldier who understood that how you leave matters as much as how you arrive. He lost an empire, but he kept his honor. He kept his promises. And in doing so, he helped shape three nations: Britain, America, and Canada. His name was the British general who lost an empire. And it is long past